My wife stood over me in emerald silk, watching me sign away my rights to her fortune. She smiled like someone who just won a chess match I didn't know we were playing. Her lawyer had marked the no claims to future assets clause in aggressive yellow highlighter, and the entire kitchen fell silent, waiting for me to push back, to argue, to show some backbone. I could have fought it. I could have walked away. Instead, I signed with steady strokes, letting her believe she'd successfully locked my life into a box labeled managed risk. What she didn't know was that tucked inside my work jacket was a cream-colored envelope from Jonathan Price, the attorney who'd been managing my grandfather's estate for 3 decades. One final signature at his office the next morning, and everything would shift. When that $200 million inheritance activated, the prenup she'd crafted so carefully wouldn't protect her. It would trap her. Because the very clause she'd insisted on, the one protecting her future earnings from my poverty, would become the iron gate that kept her locked out of a fortune she never imagined existed. Before we dive into Ethan's story, smash that like button and subscribe for more stories of quiet strength turning the tables. Drop a comment below. Are you watching from Lagos, London, Toronto, or maybe Sydney? I'd love to know where you're tuning in from around the world. Now, let's see how Ethan's patience is about to rewrite everything. The overhead lights in the kitchen cast a clinical glow across the granite island, but the temperature between Ethan and Vanessa felt 20 degrees below freezing. Vanessa stood positioned near the counter's edge, her posture that of a corporate litigator delivering closing arguments, not a wife having a conversation with her husband. The prenuptial agreement sat between them like a diagnosis, thick with legal language and highlighted sections that made Ethan's jaw tighten even as his expression remained neutral. She'd been building toward this moment for months, maybe since the engagement itself, and the detached precision with which she watched him read each clause told him exactly where he ranked in her carefully constructed world. "This is really for our mutual protection," Vanessa said, her voice carrying the same measured tone she used when explaining complex estate planning to wealthy clients who couldn't grasp the finer points. "My medical practice, the investment portfolio, the property holdings, everything I've worked for needs proper legal safeguards." She tapped the signature line with her Mont Blanc pen, the sound cutting through the silence like a gavel. "And honestly, Ethan, given your current circumstances, this just makes practical sense for both of us." The phrase current circumstances hung between them like an indictment, reducing his carpentry work to something shameful rather than the skilled craft it actually was. Ethan read through the provisions slowly, his face calm despite the knot forming in his chest. The document was exhaustive, almost vindictive in its thoroughness. It protected her assets, her future income streams, even her retirement accounts from any theoretical claim he might make in the event their marriage dissolved. It treated their union not as a partnership built on love and trust, but as a risk management strategy where he was the primary liability being hedged against. The prenuptial agreement hit the granite countertop with the weight of a guillotine blade. Vanessa stood across from Ethan in the kitchen, her tailored blazer still crisp from another 14-hour day at her medical practice, her expression clinical and completely void of warmth. She'd positioned the document precisely in the center of the island, angled so he couldn't miss the highlighted sections her attorney had marked in predatory yellow. "Sign here, here, and initial at the bottom of pages 4, 7, and 12, she said, her voice carrying that particular tone she reserved for explaining complex procedures to patients who couldn't possibly understand the medicine. "This protects both of us, Ethan. My practice, the investment accounts, the real estate portfolio. Everything I've built needs proper legal infrastructure." Ethan looked down at the pages, his calloused fingers resting on the edge of the document. He'd spent the day restoring a century-old walnut desk, sanding away decades of damage to reveal the beautiful grain beneath, and now he sat here being told his life's work meant nothing measured against her success. "Given your current circumstances," Vanessa continued, tapping her pen against the signature line, "this really is the most sensible arrangement for everyone involved. You understand that, don't you? Current circumstances." The phrase landed like a slap. His carpentry business, the craft he'd learned from his grandfather Charles, reduced to a liability that needed to be legally contained. Ethan read through the clauses slowly, each one more brutal than the last. No claim to her assets. No claim to future earnings. No claim to property acquired during the marriage. The document treated their union as a merger where he was the risk being hedged against. He could feel the cream-colored envelope from Jonathan Price pressing against his chest through his work shirt, a secret weight that changed everything. Tomorrow morning at 9, he had an appointment that would activate his grandfather's trust. $200 million, held in reserve for 3 decades, waiting for the moment Ethan found a partner worthy of the Hale family legacy. This wasn't that moment. "Where do I sign?" he asked quietly. Vanessa's smile was pure victory, cold and sharp as surgical steel. She had no idea she'd just locked herself out of a fortune she couldn't begin to imagine. The Meridian Club occupied the top floor of the Weston building, where lawyers and surgeons gathered to remind each other how exceptional they were. Vanessa had insisted Ethan join her for dinner with colleagues, though the way she'd phrased the invitation made it clear he was being displayed rather than included. He sat at the end of a table designed for people who measured their worth in billable hours, wearing the one decent sport coat he owned while Vanessa held court in designer silk. "So you actually work with your hands?" Deeker, Marcus Chun leaned forward, his tone suggesting he'd just discovered a new species. "That's so refreshingly authentic, Ethan. Most of us are completely disconnected from physical labor." "Ethan restores antique furniture," Vanessa interjected smoothly, as if she were presenting a museum exhibit. 18th century pieces, mostly. It's quite artisanal." The way she said artisanal made it sound like a hobby rather than a profession. Her colleague Jennifer Marsh, a corporate attorney with ice in her veins, swirled her wine and studied Ethan like he was a curiosity. "And that provides a stable income?" Jennifer asked, her skepticism barely concealed. "I imagine that market is rather niche." "It supports me," Ethan replied evenly, though every word felt like walking through a minefield. "Well, fortunately, Vanessa's practice is thriving," Marcus said, turning back to her as if Ethan had already disappeared. "That new cosmetic dermatology wing must be pulling in serious revenue." "Smart move, expanding into elective procedures." The conversation shifted entirely, flowing around Ethan as if he were invisible. They discussed Vanessa's strategic business decisions, her investment portfolio, her plans to open a second location. Someone made a joke about the burden of being the breadwinner, and the entire table laughed, including Vanessa. "Honestly," Jennifer said, leaning toward Vanessa with conspiratorial warmth, "I admire you for taking that risk. Not everyone would be comfortable with such an unconventional arrangement." "The prenup was smart. You protected yourself." Vanessa raised her glass. "Risk management is everything in business and marriage." Ethan sat there, his hand steady on his water glass, watching his wife accept congratulations for having the foresight to legally quarantine herself from his poverty. The cream-colored envelope from Jonathan Price seemed to burn against his chest, a secret that would turn this entire performance into ash. Tomorrow morning, every person at this table would understand exactly what kind of risk Vanessa had actually taken. And it wasn't the one she thought. Ethan was standing in the garage the next morning, running his hand along the grain of a reclaimed oak table, when he heard Vanessa's footsteps on the concrete. She rarely came out here, treating his workspace like a quarantine zone she preferred to avoid, but today she moved through the door with purpose, her eyes fixed on something in his hand. The envelope. Heavy cardstock, cream-colored, embossed with the logo of Sterling U. Price, one of the oldest estate law firms in the state. Jonathan Price's return address sat in the upper left corner in raised lettering that spoke of old money and serious legal matters. "What's that?" Vanessa's voice was casual, but her eyes were sharp, scanning every detail. "Just some paperwork," Ethan said, sliding the envelope into his jacket pocket. "Nothing important." "Sterling U. Price isn't nothing important, Ethan." She stepped closer, her professional instincts activated. "That's one of the most prestigious estate planning firms in the region. Why are they contacting you?" He could see the calculations running behind her eyes, trying to reconcile the man she'd married with the kind of person who received correspondence from attorneys who charged $1,000 an hour. The cognitive dissonance was almost visible. "It's about my grandfather's estate," he said simply. "There are some final details to settle." "Your grandfather?" Vanessa's expression shifted, a flicker of something between confusion and concern. "You never mentioned he had an estate that required Sterling U. Price." "I thought he was a carpenter like you." "He was," Ethan replied, returning his attention to the oak table. "He was also other things." The silence stretched between them, thick with questions Vanessa was too proud to ask directly. She stood there for another moment, her mind clearly working through possibilities, none of which would lead her anywhere close to the truth. "When's your appointment?" she finally asked. "This morning. 9 o'clock. "I see." She straightened her blazer, reasserting her composure. "Well, I hope it's nothing complicated. Estate matters can be such a hassle." She left the garage, but Ethan could feel the shift in the air. Vanessa Reid didn't like variables she couldn't control, and that envelope represented a blank space in the spreadsheet of his life she thought she'd completely mapped. By noon today, that blank space would become a chasm she'd never be able to cross. He picked up his keys and headed for the door, leaving the oak table unfinished. Some things were more important than restoration. Dinner at the Reid family estate was a masterclass in passive-aggressive superiority. Vanessa's father, Harrison Reid, presided over the table like a judge reviewing evidence of a particularly disappointing verdict. Her mother, Catherine, managed to smile while simultaneously conveying profound disappointment, a talent she'd perfected over decades of social dominance. "So, Ethan," Harrison began, cutting into his fillet with surgical precision, "Vanessa tells us you've been quite busy with your carpentry projects." "How industrious." The word industrious hung in the air like an insult wrapped in etiquette. Ethan recognized the game. He'd been playing it since the engagement. "I finished restoring a Victorian writing desk last week," Ethan replied. 1873, original brass hardware. "It's going to a museum collection." "How fulfilling," Catherine interjected, her tone suggesting she found it anything but. "It must be satisfying to work with your hands. So few people appreciate physical labor anymore." Of course, Vanessa's work requires such extraordinary intellectual rigor. Dermatological medicine at her level is quite demanding. "Mother," Vanessa said with a tight smile, "Ethan's work is legitimate." "Of course it is, darling." Catherine's smile never wavered. "No one is suggesting otherwise. We're simply acknowledging the reality that you've built something quite exceptional, and you've been generous enough to share that success with someone from a different background. That's admirable." Harrison set down his fork, his gaze settling on Ethan with the weight of a man accustomed to people backing down. "The prenuptial agreement was wise, Vanessa. Protecting what you've built is essential. Too many successful women make the mistake of being overly sentimental about these matters. You were pragmatic." "Ethan understood completely," Vanessa said, reaching for her wine. "He was very reasonable about the whole arrangement." "Of course he was," Harrison replied, and something in his tone made Ethan's jaw tighten. "He knows how fortunate he is to be part of this family. Not everyone gets the opportunity to move in these circles." The implication was clear: Ethan should be grateful for being tolerated, for being allowed to exist in their world despite his obvious inadequacy. He sat there, eating food prepared by their private chef, in a house that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime, while being told he should feel lucky they'd let him through the door. What none of them knew was that the appointment with Jonathan Price that morning had changed everything. The trust was active. The inheritance was real. And the prenup Vanessa had crafted so carefully, the one her father was praising right now, had become the cage that would keep all of them locked out. Ethan raised his glass. "To family," he said quietly. The irony was almost too perfect. Vanessa's behavior changed overnight, and it wasn't subtle. She came home early on Wednesday, something she never did, carrying takeout from the Italian restaurant where they'd had their first date. She'd changed out of her clinical whites into a soft cashmere sweater, her hair down instead of pulled back in its usual severe twist. "I thought we could have dinner together," she said, setting the containers on the counter with calculated casualness. "We haven't really talked lately." Ethan recognized manipulation when he saw it. He'd watched her deploy this exact strategy with difficult patients and stubborn pharmaceutical reps. First came the warmth, the manufactured intimacy, then the careful questions designed to extract information. "That sounds nice," he said, because watching this performance unfold was almost fascinating. They ate at the kitchen island, and Vanessa asked about his work with an attentiveness that would have seemed genuine if he didn't know better. She laughed at his stories about difficult restoration projects, touched his hand when she reached for the wine bottle, created an atmosphere of domestic harmony that felt completely artificial. "I've been thinking," she said finally, swirling her Chianti with studied nonchalance. "About your grandfather's estate. That meeting with Sterling U. Price. You've seemed different since then." There it was. The real agenda. different how? Ethan asked. I don't know. Distracted, maybe. Is everything okay? You know you can talk to me about these things. Her voice was warm, concerned, the voice of a caring partner rather than a woman who'd made him sign away his rights to her fortune 6 days ago. Everything's fine, he replied. Just some family business that needed attention. Family business with one of the most expensive law firms in the state. She leaned closer, her hand covering his. Ethan, if there's something going on, something complicated, I want to help. We're partners. You don't have to carry everything alone. Partners. The word would have been laughable if it wasn't so grotesque. They'd been married for 2 years, and she'd spent most of that time treating him like a project that required management rather than a person deserving respect. I appreciate that, he said, meeting her eyes directly. But really, it's handled. He could see the frustration flickering across her face, quickly masked by another warm smile. She'd expected this approach to work, expected that kindness and attention would crack whatever reserve he'd built up. What she didn't understand was that he wasn't withholding information out of spite. He was waiting for the right moment. That moment was coming sooner than she thought. The next morning, Vanessa's office received a call from an attorney named Patricia Monroe, requesting an urgent meeting to discuss matters related to the marital estate and recent financial disclosures. Vanessa's confusion would turn to panic within 48 hours. The conference room at Sterling U. Price occupied the entire southwest corner of the 40th floor, floor-to-ceiling windows offering a view of the city that suggested both power and permanence. Jonathan Price sat at the head of the table, 73 years old and sharp as the day Charles Hale had first retained him, his silver hair and tailored suit speaking of old-school professionalism. Vanessa sat beside Ethan, her posture rigid, her face carefully neutral. When she'd received the formal invitation to this meeting, phrased as a mandatory disclosure session regarding significant marital assets, she'd gone pale. Her own attorney, Gerald Spencer, sat on her other side, his leather portfolio open and his expression wary. Thank you for joining us, Dieter Reid, Jonathan began, his voice carrying the weight of decades spent delivering life-changing news. What we're about to discuss will require some context. Ethan, if you'll permit me? Ethan nodded, and Jonathan opened a burgundy leather folder embossed with the Hale family crest. Charles Edward Hale established a discretionary family trust in 1994, funded initially with $12 million from the sale of his manufacturing patents and commercial real estate holdings. Over 30 years, through conservative investment and strategic management, that trust has grown to its current value of $203 million. The number landed like a detonation. Vanessa's head snapped toward Ethan, her eyes wide with something between shock and betrayal. Gerald Spencer's pen stopped moving. The trust, Jonathan continued calmly, was structured with specific behavioral conditions designed to ensure it passed only to an heir who demonstrated both humility and genuine partnership in marriage. The trust required that Ethan maintain honest employment, avoid ostentation, and marry someone who valued him for his character rather than his assets. Upon meeting these conditions and reaching his 35th birthday, the trust would activate. That birthday, Jonathan said, looking directly at Vanessa, was 6 days ago. The trust is now active, and Ethan Hale is the sole beneficiary of $203 million in assets, securities, and real property. The silence in the room was absolute. Vanessa's face had gone from shock to pale fury, her mind clearly racing through every conversation, every condescending comment, every moment she'd treated Ethan like a charity case she was generous enough to tolerate. The prenuptial agreement you executed, Jonathan continued, pulling out a copy of the document, specifically includes a clause protecting all future assets and inheritance acquired by either party during the marriage as separate property. You insisted on this language. Your attorney drafted it. Gerald Spencer leaned forward, scanning the document, and Ethan watched as the color drained from his face. Dieter Reid, Gerald said quietly, this clause means. It means, Jonathan finished, that your prenuptial agreement has legally barred you from any claim to the largest fortune your husband will ever receive. You protected yourself so thoroughly that you locked yourself out completely. Vanessa turned to Ethan, her expression a war between rage and desperation. You knew. You knew about this when I made you sign those papers. I did, Ethan replied calmly. And I signed them anyway because I wanted to see if you could value me without knowing what I was worth. You gave me your answer. The meeting continued for another hour, but Vanessa barely heard it. She sat there, drowning in the realization that she'd just lost $200 million because she'd been too arrogant to see the man sitting beside her as anything more than a risk that needed to be managed. Gerald Spencer's office had become a war room. Papers spread across every surface as he searched desperately for a legal foothold that didn't exist. Vanessa paced behind him, her controlled facade completely shattered, her voice climbing toward genuine panic. There has to be something, she insisted for the third time. A technicality, a challenge to the trust's validity, fraud, misrepresentation, something. Gerald looked up from the prenuptial agreement, his expression carrying the weight of a lawyer who knew he was about to deliver devastating news to a client who wouldn't accept it. Vanessa, I've reviewed every clause, every provision, every piece of precedent I can find. The trust is ironclad. It was structured by Sterling U. Price 30 years ago, funded legally, managed conservatively, and it meets every requirement under state and federal law. There's no challenge to be made. He lied to me, Vanessa said, her hands gripping the back of the chair. He deliberately concealed his assets before we married. That's fraud. No, Gerald replied gently, it's not. He was under no legal obligation to disclose the trust, especially since it wasn't activated until after your marriage. And more importantly, he tapped the highlighted section of the prenuptial agreement. You specifically included language that protected future inheritance as separate property. You wrote this clause, Vanessa. Your language. Your protection. The reality was crushing. Vanessa had been so focused on protecting her own assets, so confident in her superior position, that she'd built an impenetrable wall around everything she owned. That same wall now stood between her and $200 million she'd never imagined existed. What about marital abandonment? She tried, grasping at anything. If he leaves, if he files for divorce, surely that changes things? It doesn't. Gerald closed the folder, his voice firm. The prenup treats all future inheritance as separate property regardless of divorce proceedings. In fact, if you file for divorce, you'll walk away with exactly what you brought into the marriage and nothing more. That's what you wanted. That's what you insisted on. Vanessa sank into the chair, her mind clearly spinning through every moment of the past 2 years, every condescending comment, every time she'd treated Ethan like he should be grateful for her tolerance. She'd been so certain of her position, so convinced of his inferiority, that she'd never considered the possibility that she might be wrong. There's one more thing you should know, Gerald said quietly. I spoke with Jonathan Price this morning. Ethan isn't filing for divorce. He's proposing a separation agreement. A separation? Vanessa's voice cracked. What kind of separation? 90 days. He'll move out, maintain separate residence, and you'll both attend mandatory counseling. At the end of 90 days, if you can demonstrate genuine change, he'll consider reconciliation. If not, he'll file for divorce and you'll receive nothing beyond what the prenup specifies. This is insane, Vanessa whispered. He's punishing me. No, Gerald replied, and something in his tone made Vanessa look up. He's giving you a chance to decide if you can value him as a person rather than an asset. That's more generous than most people would be in his position. The irony was suffocating. Vanessa had spent 2 years managing Ethan like a liability, and now she was being offered 90 days to prove she could see him as something more. The question was whether her pride would survive the humiliation long enough to try. The Meridian Club felt different the second time Ethan walked through its doors. The same mahogany panels, the same pretentious art, but now the staff recognized him as Jonathan Price's client, which meant he was someone who mattered. He'd come for a meeting with a potential investor, but word had traveled fast in the closed ecosystem of wealth and influence. Dr. Marcus Chung intercepted him before he reached the private dining room, his smile warm and completely artificial. Ethan. I was hoping I'd run into you. Marcus extended his hand with an enthusiasm that hadn't existed 3 weeks ago. I wanted to apologize for the other night. I think some of our comments may have come across as insensitive. Ethan shook his hand, his expression neutral. It's fine, Marcus. Listen, I'm actually in the process of expanding my practice's aesthetic medicine division, and I'd love to get your perspective on some investment opportunities. Maybe we could grab lunch? My treat, obviously. Obviously. Because now Ethan was someone worth cultivating rather than tolerating. The shift was so transparent it was almost sad. Jennifer Marsh appeared moments later, her approach slightly more sophisticated but equally calculated. Ethan, I heard about the trust. That's quite a legacy your grandfather left. I don't know if Vanessa mentioned it, but I specialize in estate planning for high-net-worth individuals. I'd be happy to review your asset protection strategy, pro bono of course. Consider it a courtesy between friends. Friends. They'd spent an entire evening treating him like Vanessa's quaint social experiment, and now they wanted to be friends. I appreciate the offer, Ethan replied, but Sterling, Price has everything handled. Of course, of course. Jennifer's smile tightened just slightly. But if you ever need a second opinion, or if you're looking to diversify your legal representation, please keep me in mind. The parade continued throughout the afternoon. Colleagues who'd ignored him now wanted his time. Business owners who'd dismissed his carpentry work now asked for referrals to his other investments. The same people who'd congratulated Vanessa for protecting herself with a prenup now praised Ethan's grandfather's wisdom in establishing such a well-structured trust. Harrison Reid called that evening, his voice carrying a warmth that hadn't existed during their last dinner. Ethan, I wanted to reach out personally. I think there may have been some misunderstandings about our family's perception of you. Catherine and I would love to have you over for dinner, just the three of us. Clear the air, discuss the future. The future. Now that he had $200 million, suddenly he had a future worth discussing. I'm separated from Vanessa, Harrison, Ethan said quietly. I'm not sure a family dinner makes sense right now. All the more reason to talk, Harrison pressed. Perhaps I can help mediate. I have some experience with delicate marital situations. Ethan ended the call politely but firmly. These people hadn't changed. They'd simply recalibrated their assessment of his value, and their sudden interest felt hollow and opportunistic. They'd revealed who they really were when they thought he was poor, and no amount of forced courtesy now could erase that truth. The only person who hadn't called was Vanessa. And that silence said more than any conversation could. Ethan's new apartment overlooked the river, a furnished two-bedroom in a building where nobody knew his name or his net worth. He'd moved out 3 days after the meeting at Sterling Price, taking only his clothes, his tools, and the framed photograph of his grandfather that had sat on his workshop bench for a decade. The separation agreement sat on the kitchen counter, signed by both parties, witnessed by attorneys, enforceable by law. 90 days. Mandatory counseling every Tuesday and Thursday. No contact except through designated channels. At the end of the period, either they would attempt genuine reconciliation based on mutual respect, or they would divorce and Vanessa would walk away with exactly what she'd brought into the marriage. The first counseling session had been brutal. Dr. Sarah Martinez, a family therapist who specialized in high-conflict marriages, had asked Vanessa a simple question: can you tell me 3 things you genuinely respect about Ethan that have nothing to do with his recent inheritance? Vanessa had sat in silence for almost 2 full minutes, her face cycling through emotions before she finally whispered, I don't know. That answer had been both devastating and clarifying. She didn't know because she'd never bothered to look. She'd categorized Ethan as a project from day one, someone to be managed rather than known, and now she was facing the reality that she'd married a stranger because she'd been too arrogant to see him as a person. The second session had been worse. Dr. Martinez had asked Ethan, what would reconciliation look like for you? What would Vanessa need to demonstrate? She'd need to prove she could value me if I lost everything tomorrow, Ethan had replied. If the trust disappeared, if I went back to just being a carpenter with sawdust under his nails, would she still want to be married to me? Because if the answer is no, then we don't have a marriage. We have a transaction. Vanessa had left that session in tears, and Ethan had felt no satisfaction in her pain. This wasn't about revenge. It was about dignity. About refusing to spend his life with someone who saw him as a risk assessment rather than a partner. Now, sitting in his apartment with the city lights reflected in the river below, Ethan received a text from Jonathan Price, the trust board has reviewed your separation agreement. They've approved your decision. Your grandfather would be proud. You chose integrity over revenge. Charles Hale had built that trust not just to pass on wealth, but to ensure it went to someone who understood that character mattered more than money. Ethan had proven that by signing Vanessa's prenup even when he knew what was coming. He'd given her every chance to see him as something more than his bank account. The question now was whether Vanessa could change, whether she could look past her wounded pride and discover the person she'd been too blind to notice. Ethan wasn't optimistic, but he was giving her the opportunity. That was more than most people would do. His phone buzzed again. A text from Vanessa, the first direct communication since the separation began. "I'm sorry. I know that's not enough. But I'm going to try. I promise I'm going to try." Ethan stared at the message for a long moment, then set the phone down without responding. Words were easy. Change was hard. The next 87 days would reveal which one Vanessa was actually capable of. Outside his window, the city continued its endless rhythm, indifferent to the small human drama playing out in a riverside apartment. Ethan picked up a piece of reclaimed walnut he'd brought from his workshop and began sketching designs for a jewelry box. Sometimes the best way to process complicated emotions was to create something beautiful from broken pieces. Time would tell if his marriage could be restored the same way.